we're looking together at what is one of the most beautiful stories in all of the Bible. And I've been drawn to it for at least three reasons. First, because it is a story about ordinary people that every single one of us can relate to. Second, because it is a story about our extraordinary God. And you know, when you bring ordinary people and our extraordinary God together, you know what you get is a story of redemption.
Welcome to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith. Glad you could be with us today. I'm David Pick, a little bit croaky, but hanging in there. And Colin, what is the message we're going to hear today?
We're going to look at the beautiful story of the book of Ruth, the story of two women and how God wonderfully provided for them. And one of the things I find so compelling about this story is that it really is a story of ordinary people. You know, you look at some of the stories in the Bible, Jonah's adventures on the inside of a giant fish, you know, Abraham and Isaac, Moses parting the Red Sea. You know, you may find yourself saying, well, I can't imagine ever being in a position that these folks were in. But the story of Ruth and of Naomi is a story that everybody can relate to. It's a story about a family. It's a story about loss. It's a story about God's wonderful redeeming provision and his great kindness even in the hardest of circumstances. It is a beautiful story, and I'm so glad that we're going to be able to immerse ourselves in it over these next days.
So we're going to be in the book of Ruth today, so join us in your Bible if you can. The first 5 verses as we begin the message, Loss. Here's Colin.
Now, there are two ways to approach a story like the story of Ruth that is before us today and in these coming weeks. One is to stand with each of the characters in their loves and in their joys and in their tears and in their sorrows as they move progressively through each stage of their journey. The other, of course, is to start with the big picture, to see how the story ends, and so better to be able to understand what is actually going on along the way. And I want us to do both of these things during this series. And so today I want us to see both how the story begins and also how it ends. And of course, that's appropriate for Christian believers because we know how our story ends. We know that because God has revealed it to us. In Jesus Christ, whatever the sorrows and loss that you are experiencing right now, in Jesus Christ, your story does not end with tears and loss. Your story in Jesus Christ will end with fullness of joy in your Father's house, where all tears will be wiped away from your eyes. God has told us how our story ends, and he has told us how our story ends so that we may be able to live with hope when we face sorrow and when we face loss along the way. Now, we're looking together at what is one of the most beautiful stories in all of the Bible, and I've been drawn to it for at least 3 reasons. First, because it is a story about ordinary people that every single one of us can relate to. Second, because it is a story about our extraordinary God. And you know, when you bring ordinary people and our extraordinary God together, you know what you get is a story of redemption. And that's the very heart of what this story is all about. So we're going to look at these 3 things today as we look at how it begins and how it ends. First then, this is a story about ordinary people. Now, many of the stories in the Bible, of course, are about unusual people who do remarkable things. We read about Abraham offering his son on an altar, Moses leading God's people out of Egypt, David slaying a giant by the name of Goliath. And we read these stories with a sense of wonder, but sometimes we may think to ourselves, when would I ever do anything remotely like any of these people? But everyone can relate to this story which is about the lives, the loves, and the losses of one ordinary family. The story begins telling us when it took place. Verse 1, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now, these days of the judges, where this story took place, were really terrible times. If you know the story of the book of Judges, you will remember that this was a period where God's people repeatedly turned to idols. And when they did, they were overpowered by enemies who invaded and then oppressed them. When that happened, God's people cried out to him for help. That's always the first instinct of a believing person, by the way, isn't it? We may forget the Lord when things are going well, but when we're in trouble, our first instinct is to call out to God and ask him for help. And when God's people asked him for help, what he did was he raised up judges. They were really military leaders who drove out the enemies from the land. And peace was restored for as long as the judge lived. But when the judge died, what happened repeatedly was that God's people turned to idols again, and then enemies invaded the land, and you were back to the start all over again. So God's people throughout the time of the judges were just lurching from one crisis to another. And if you think about that, you may think, well, this is perhaps a story that speaks to our day as well. This is a story that speaks to our times. The days of the judges were days of desperately flawed leaders. None of them had a lasting impact for good. They did some good and then it all got washed away. And God's people lived with a profound sense that life in the promised land should be better than this. It's a story that speaks to our times because it was in the days of the judges, when the judges ruled. Notice what happened. There was a famine in the land. Wow, a famine in the promised land. This is the land that God gave to his people, a land flowing with milk and with honey. And notice that this famine was, of all places, in Bethlehem. Bethlehem simply means the house of bread. And the little town of Bethlehem was given its name clearly because the fields in that immediate area were particularly fertile. A famine in Bethlehem? Why was there a famine? Well, the first thing that comes to our mind is that God must have held back the rain. And indeed, that could be the reason for the famine that is stated here. But there could be another explanation. In the book of Judges, so from this time in which the story is set, we read these words in Judges chapter 6 and verse 3. Whenever the Israelites planted crops, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them. They would encamp against them and devour the produce of the land and leave no sustenance in Israel. They would come like locusts in number, so that they laid waste the land as they came in. Now, can you imagine the frustration? If year after year you planted your field, you raised your crop, and just before harvest, the enemy came in like locusts, possibly burning your fields, trampling them down, destroying your crop. And that happened, leaving you hungry year after year. And one reason for thinking that the famine may have been because the crops were destroyed by enemies is that while there was famine in Bethlehem, there clearly was food in Moab, and Moab, as the crow flies, is only, well, it's less than 50 miles from Bethlehem. So the book of Ruth begins by telling us that one family, finding themselves in this desperately frustrating situation, they made a decision. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. So this family then, as you think about the location, they left their fields in Bethlehem. They took a journey around the north edge of the Dead Sea, and then they went down south until they arrived in Moab. Now, here we come to a question that will affect how we understand and apply this story. And here's the question. Did Elimelech make a mistake when he moved to Moab? Should he have stayed in Bethlehem and simply trusted God to provide?
You're listening to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith and a message called Loss, based on the book of Ruth. It's part of our series, Ordinary People, Extraordinary God. And if you ever miss part of the series, don't forget you can always come online to catch up or go back and listen again by coming to our website, openthebible.org.uk. You can also find Pastor Colin's messages as a podcast, and those are on all the main podcast sites. Search for Open the Bible UK. Back to the message now. Here's Colin.
Now, here we come to a question that will affect how we understand and apply this story. And here's the question. Did Elimelech make a mistake when he moved to Moab? Should he have stayed in Bethlehem and simply trusted God to provide? Now, some commentators absolutely castigate Elimelech and Naomi for moving to Moab. This was, some say, abandoning trust in God, backsliding, direct disobedience to a biblical command. They should have stayed in the land that God had promised to bless and trusted God to provide. There are many who make that case and make that argument and produce various verses from the Old Testament law in support of it. But there are many examples of faithful believers moving in times of famine or other particular trouble. So in Genesis in chapter 12, you have Abraham went to Egypt in a time of famine. In Genesis 26, Isaac went to Gerar. In Genesis 46, you have Jacob, of course, joining, and the whole family joining Joseph, who was the means of God's provision in Egypt during a time of famine. In 1 Samuel chapter 22, David took his father and his mother to Moab, and the king of Moab protected them while David was on the run with the King Saul seeking to take his life. There's an occasion in 2 Samuel chapter 8 where Elisha the prophet says to a Shunammite woman, now there's going to be a famine here, and so you ought to go to another country in order to take refuge. And supremely, our Lord Jesus Christ was taken to Egypt by Mary and by Joseph when King Herod was seeking to destroy him. Now, the Bible makes no comment on the family's move to Moab. It simply tells us that this is what they did. Now, a similar question arises over the marriage of Mahlon and Chilion to Orpah and Ruth. Was this not a breaking of the Old Testament law? God has made clear beyond question, in both the Old and the New Testaments, that his people should not marry those who do not believe. But it is perfectly possible that Orpah and Ruth had professed faith in the Lord. After all, they had clearly come under the influence of Naomi. And even though Orpah turned back, as we will see later in the story, the fact that Ruth and Orpah accompanied Naomi on her return to the Promised Land seems to indicate that they had made some sort of profession of faith in the living God. One of the most helpful commentaries that I have found on the book of Ruth is by Ludwig Lavater. Lavater was a Swiss theologian who served in Zurich during the 16th century. And I mention that because the 16th century was a pretty harsh time in which many people said some pretty harsh things. And with that background, I was struck by and found Lavater's comments to be especially helpful. He asks the question, did Elimelech do right in migrating to Moab with his family? And then he answers, one can argue both sides. So if you're really big on one side or the other, don't bother sending me an email because I'll just say, that's fine. One can argue both sides. Then he lays out the arguments on both sides over several pages, and then he says this. When the scriptures do not accuse men, neither ought we to accuse them. And when matters are ambiguous, we should rather believe better things about men. Now, friends, that is a very important principle of biblical interpretation and of life. Where there is doubt about another person's actions, love chooses to believe the best. Remember the words of Jesus, with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. So if you've heard that and if you believe it, you will always want in life to use the most generous measure that you possibly can. Writing in the 19th century, another fine commentator, George Lawson, makes a similar point in regards to the marriages of Mahlon and Chilion. He says this, if Mahlon and Chilion had good reason to think that their intended wives were sincere proselytes to their religion, in other words, that they'd converted to faith in the living God, then they deserve no blame, but rather praise. And then he says this, why should we pronounce a sentence against any man when we are neither called to be his judges nor furnished with means for judging? Christians are called to a life of love. We are called to love all people and especially to love one another. Loving means that we will take the most generous view that we can of the words and actions of others, that we are to think the best of them. I was greatly helped some years ago by a kindly word from a dear friend following a sermon that I had preached. I had spoken on the leper who said to Jesus, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And I had drawn attention to the word if. Doubt. Here's a man who's not sure if he believes. And my friend said, that's not the most generous view of that verse. It might have been that he was simply submitting himself to the will of Christ. If you are willing, you will make me clean. I'd not taken the most generous view. And he simply said to me, what we owe to others in life, we also owe to characters in the Bible. And it works the other way. What we owe to characters in the Bible, we also owe to others in life. Never assume the worst. Always think the best, unless compelled by evidence to the contrary that cannot be put in a better light. Now, why would I take time over this today? Well, one reason is that we all know what it is to look back at decisions that we made and wonder if we did the right thing. You know this in your life as I know it in mine. Did I make the right decision? Was that an act of faith, or was it an act of folly? But do you see that the focus of this story that we're going to follow in these coming weeks is actually not on whether Elimelech made the right decision. It's on how God brings blessing to his people in every circumstance of life. Whatever the decisions you may have made. So don't waste your time and your energy reassessing the decisions of your life in the rear view mirror. What is done is done. Have faith in God who works in all things for the good of those who love him. What that means is that God works for our good when our decisions are wise, and God works for our good when our decisions should have been wiser. One commentator says very beautifully, God's kind providence covers even our mistakes. Aren't you thankful for that? God's kind providence covers even our mistakes. That's why you don't need to live your life in regret and second guessing. Because you have a God who works for your good, whether your decisions in the past were wise or whether they should have been wiser.
You've been listening to Pastor Colin Smith on Open the Bible and a message called Loss from the book of Ruth. It's from our series, Ordinary People, Extraordinary God. And if you ever miss one of the series, don't forget you can always catch up or go back and listen again online at our website, openthebible.org.uk. Open the Bible is supported financially by our listeners. That's people just like you. And if you already do that, we want to send you a big thank you. If that's something you're considering doing in the future, if you're able to set up a new direct debit to the work of Open the Bible in the amount of £5 per month or more, or a one-off gift of £50 or more, we'd love to say thank you by sending you a copy of Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Easter, plus the booklet, 6 Days That Changed the World by Colin Smith, and a lovely Open the Bible tote bag, bookmark and pen. All of that if you're able to begin supporting Open the Bible financially this month. Colin, what do you think makes this book so useful?
Oh, well, its author, Lee Strobel, was a journalist for the Chicago Tribune when he began exploring the Christian faith. And in The Case for Easter, he actually retraces his steps, showing the biblical evidence that led him to the conclusion that Jesus really rose from the dead. It's a fascinating book because he interviews experts who help us to sort through the Bible's evidence for the resurrection. So, for example, he interviews a medical doctor to help us examine the evidence that Jesus really died, and a psychologist to help us see that Jesus' appearances could not have been simply hallucinations. So The Case for Easter really helps Christians know why we believe in the resurrection, and it can provide a wonderful pathway to faith for someone who's beginning to explore the truths of Christianity.
Well, we want to send you a copy of Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Easter, plus the booklet 6 Days That Changed the World by Colin Smith, plus, of course, a lovely Open the Bible tote bag, bookmark and pen. If you're able to set up a new direct debit to the work of Open the Bible this month in the amount of £5 per month or a one-off gift of £50 or more. Full terms and conditions and to give online, come to our website openthebible.org.uk. For Open the Bible, Pastor Colin Smith, I'm David Pick, and I hope you'll join us again next time. We're looking at one of the most beautiful stories in the Bible, the story of Ruth. It's all about ordinary people, our extraordinary God, and it's a story of redemption. Find out more next time on Open the Bible.